Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, August 5th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds at 5:20 in the afternoon of September 11th, 2001. Before we go further, though, let me introduce you to our operations manager here at AE 9/11 Truth and the host of 9/11 Freefall Radio, Mr. Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is in the questions and information forum online at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see it right there. I'll also be looking over the Facebook comments and YouTube comments for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting today. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks so much, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what happened, what really happened at the World Trade Center, using the material in these courses. Speaking of the World Trade Center, did you know there were 3 towers that came down? Most architects and engineers know nothing about the third tower. Most Americans know nothing about it. We hardly saw anything from it after day one at the World Trade Center. So we look at it because guess what? This building, which is half the height of the Twin Towers, dwarfed by the tallest buildings in the world, is still a 47-story skyscraper. And so for a 47-story skyscraper to come down after not having been hit by an airplane is an extraordinary event. That's why we're going to start with it in this 3-part series this month in August. And then we'll get on to the Twin Towers in week 2 and week 3. It is just outside the super block of the World Trade Center, and and it is part of the World Trade Center complex, about 100 yards north of the North Tower, well, from the North Tower. And it did indeed have some of the debris that came down on it from the North Tower do some damage, but not a significant factor in the building's collapse, according to Nist, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. Here, the building is standing just fine. Immediately following the destruction of the World Trade Center. It had a few small scattered fires in. We'll be looking at those in a moment, but let's just see what happens at 5:20 in the afternoon. The east penthouse collapses first, as you see there, and 6 seconds later, this happens. And so we're going to be taking this apart piece by piece. But let's first listen to the official story. See what is the narrative that developed about this building's collapse.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, well, let's look at those fires. These are those fires. As you can see, they are few, relatively small, and scattered throughout the building on about 10 different floors. These are the worst fire photos and videos that we have. These are the worst fires that we have photos and videos for. And this is the area of concern. We'll look at that on the east side on the 11th and 12th floor. Those fires were burning in the area of Nist's initiation of collapse at about 2:30, but those fires moved on by 3 p.m. toward the west side and across from left to right here. Nist early on noted the damage to the building, but they later said that this was an insignificant factor, relatively insignificant, in the cause of the building's collapse. They focused on over here in the northeast section, which is underneath the east penthouse, because presumably it fell first. So that's where their energy has been put. So they develop a fire progression simulation here with at 2 p.m. the fire on the south side, which is facing the north tower, and then this fire develops at 3 o'clock on the east side, and at 4 p.m. it's hovering around column 79 for the last hour and a half or so of this building's life. And so this is actually a huge problem, because they do even acknowledge in their report that such fires did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. That is the reality that fire protection engineers agree on. There's only so much fuel to burn in modern office buildings like this. So the fires actually were burnt out by 3:50 on the north side. So this is extremely important, because this is what the photographs show, and this is what is an opposite to what Nist has claimed here, that these fires were burning, as we noted, at 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock. More likely, according to the photographs themselves, the fires are moving around from east to northeast and are off of the building before 4 o'clock, off of the column 79 area. In fact, completely burn out on that floor by 5 p.m., 20 minutes before the collapse, as shown by the photos and videos that we have, which is in complete contradiction, as I mentioned, to what Nist is claiming here in their fire simulation video. Apparently, they have a stake in exaggerating the length, duration, and location of those fires in order to prop up their fire initiation collapse theory. Let's go further with that, though.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
So fires inducing a progressive collapse. Let's look deeper into it.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
So they're saying that this column 79 buckles. Well, what happens before that? In their 1,000-page report on the collapse of this building, you can ultimately decipher that they're saying that these long span beams expanded through thermal means, that because the fires were hovering in this area at the time of the collapse, which the photos show weren't true. But also you can see that the halfway through construction here and application of the fireproofing, the beams were fireproofed, and so they couldn't have expanded but Nist did their test without the fireproofing, and they put the heat into the beams, 1400 degrees Fahrenheit or so, 1600 maybe, in just half a second, which in terms of the physics of steel causes it to expand rather than sag, which it normally would do, as you'll see in a moment. It's what happens in fires in steel frame buildings. So anyway, none of that could have even happened. But what they're saying that is relevant here is that the girder got pushed by these beams off of its seat on this column 79. Well, the girder couldn't have been pushed. Why? Because the girder has 30 shear studs tying it up to the concrete slab up above. It could not possibly have been pushed. But Nist omits these key structural elements from their analysis so that they can develop their claim that this girder was pushed off of the seat. So that couldn't have happened, but let's say it did. It would have had to have been pushed not 6 inches as Nist claims, but 12 inches off of its seat. Why? Because that seat is 12 inches long and that beam is 11 inches wide. And so actually, I think it's 12 inches wide also, the bottom flange. Well, they say, no, it only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat, and then the bottom flange folded. Well, that could not have happened because, once again, that bottom flange is secured or supported by this 3/4 inch stiffener in elevation view we see here, which is welded to it. And as you see in plan view here. But they omit these, once again, key structural elements in order to develop their theory without concern to the reality of what would have happened. So that couldn't happen, but let's say it did, and this girder got pushed off of its seat. Well, they're saying floor 13 fell on 12, 12 on 11, and so on for 9 floors. And then, and could that have happened? No. Why? Because there's 2 other massive girders framing into this column, which would have supported that floor, or most all of it. And that it probably wouldn't even have hit the floor, much less developed enough dynamic force to break the girder connection down below. And that's proven by Tony Zamboti, who developed an analysis that shows that it would have required 632,000 pounds of dynamic force to break that connection below. But it only had 1/10 of that available. So that's another reason, yet another, that the Nist theory falls flat on its face. But what do they say? They say the upper floor fell and the lower floor caused a progressive collapse. Let's say that could have happened. Well, it would have pulled in the perimeter structural steel framing system such that you'd see it crumpling like a beer can. And as we noted in the video of the collapse, and as we will note again, it doesn't. It just comes straight down. Like the old hotels in Las Vegas. This is not an organic collapse whatsoever. Well, here's their animation of the model. Let's take a look.
Here's our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
We'll see about that. But what we see is 400 structural steel connections failing virtually all at once on the left side here. That can't happen in a robust, redundantly designed steel frame building like this. And what else do we see? Well, let's compare it actually directly to the video of the collapse on the left. You don't see the crumpling up of the exterior. Even in the model, you don't see much of that. But after 2 seconds into the overall collapse, the building begins to tip over. It looks nothing like the actual video of the collapse, except that East Penthouse falling first, which they succeeded in mimicking well, but none of the rest of this makes any sense. So we've got to look a little deeper, and we made an effort to do that with Freedom of Information request, which was denied. And they said, why? It might jeopardize public safety. Wait a minute. How does it not jeopardize public safety if you refuse to give the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? After all, if this building could come down by fire alone at free fall acceleration, which we'll get into, then there are other similarly designed buildings that could suffer a fate like that as well. So this is obviously an effort to avoid the public scrutiny of their computer input data. So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. We have a question, of course. What caused this building to collapse? Well, we do some background research. We make observations. How have other buildings collapsed? We construct a hypothesis. We make predictions based on that hypothesis. Maybe it came down by fire. That's a hypothesis that is very reasonable, at least to consider. Controlled demolition with explosives is another hypothesis, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. We test those hypotheses with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is supported, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. We have the right to depend on the quality and accuracy of the data. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we're beginning already to see in the case of Nist's initiation theory of collapse theory, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis until we find one that is corroborated by the experiments, the data, the research, the analysis, etc. So let's do some research and find out what are the forces that destroy buildings. Fire is certainly one of them. In fact, there's a series. Fire is an organic, chaotic process. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So fires only last 20 or 30 minutes. This is acknowledged throughout the industry, and yet Nist claimed that column 79 area was on fire for an hour and a half. It's a complete contradiction. Well, we haven't lost a skyscraper, as we'll see, to fires, but say in wood frame buildings, the building would begin to fall over in stages. The wood structure itself is combustible, although we try to protect that in larger buildings with gypsum board and other means. We haven't lost a steel framed fireproofed building ever. So let's look and see why. Even in this case, the largest test done in the world, the beams, many of them in this test are fireproofed, and many of them, like these, are not. And the columns, same thing. So let's take a look.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Uh-oh. So, indeed, we have inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form, Jonathan Barnett says. Well, that's the executive summary. So he was narrating it, Jonathan Barnett. In fact, we've never lost a steel frame skyscraper that's fireproofed due to fire ever. Take a look.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, in fact, not one of these fires post 9/11 in high-rise steel frame fireproof buildings collapsed. Not one of them. So all of a sudden on 9/11, we have not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse in the case of Building 7, fire alone. So it's an extraordinary claim to suggest that that building came down by fire, and it requires extraordinary evidence, which we're not seeing whatsoever. In fact, we'll be showing you the evidence of what did clearly, irrefutably bring it down in a moment. So these buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete expanding in cauliflower shapes, which is a function of incredible heat from inside due to the chemical reaction from the explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Now, we're bringing this up because explosions are not a part of the official story for this building's destruction, Building 7. And yet, let's look at a typical controlled demolition, which can also be harnesses explosions very effectively to bring down virtually all buildings that are high rises that are brought down. In fact, it takes a team of experts to engineer the placement of the shaped cutter charges at the columns and beams, and it takes months to prepare these buildings. So it doesn't happen by fire alone. There's a set of features, in fact, that are associated with controlled demolitions. Let's look at them. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure. We have a straight down symmetrical progression, if that's what they want to do. And usually it is to not cause damage to adjacent buildings. That happens with the patterned removal of column supports. That's how you get that symmetry. And that results in a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure that was holding the building up. And it results in a total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. It's shattered. Feature number 6, limited damage to adjacent structures. That is one of the goals of controlled demolition. There's patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. If you have these features, again, you might darn well be sure you had a controlled demolition, especially if all the concrete floors are broken up, or in the case of the World Trade Center demolitions, powdered, pulverized to a powder. Explosive charges are visible at many floors. These are called squibs in the explosives demolition industry. And chemical evidence, of course, left behind of explosive devices. If you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. That is in the case of wood frame buildings. We haven't lost a steel frame skyscraper. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, that can be very helpful. Foreknowledge, because you don't just bring down a building in a day. People are aware of it ahead of time, which we'll be looking at evidence of today. And experts agreeing, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. Well, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of what is a controlled demolition or not. Video documentation, which we're going to be continuing to look at today. All of this can be proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we're going to apply to World Trade Center Building 7, beginning with, is there or was there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure? Let's listen to Dan Rather as we see another of the 11 videos that of this building's collapse.
And what you're seeing are high shots.
We'll see several of them.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, Dan is using his intuition here, because we've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas, and that's what it looks like. So problem is he never explained or discussed this publicly after 9/11. And we haven't even seen this building collapse except 2 or 3 times on mainstream television. So it's been swept under the rug somehow. Feature number 2, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's look from West Street. Yeah, pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Now, notice the collapse a half a second prior to the overall collapse, the collapse of the screen wall and west penthouse. It collapses completely uniformly across its width in just half a second, indicating what? That the core columns gave way underneath it that was supporting that structure all at once. So this is in complete contradiction to Nist's theory that this instability started on the east, which is on the left here in this video, and traveled in 6 seconds across the width of this football field length building. No, all the core columns gave way at once, a half a second prior to the perimeter columns, in order to bring down that core structure. So yet another nail in the coffin of the Nist report. And yes, it falls mostly into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint, as you can see. So a rather perfect controlled demolition. Let's compare it to a series of controlled demolitions on the right. Building 7 on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition? Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a steel frame skyscraper ever before in history. Should it not have been the main hypothesis, if not the only one that's rational and relevant to study? But no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions of Nist 10 years later, put up on their website. Did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse of World Trade Center 7? Nist concluded that the blast events inside the building did not occur and found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. The smallest blast capable of falling the building's critical column would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels. Well, maybe so if traditional high energy explosives were used, but we're going to be looking at evidence for something different than that today. And yet we're asked to believe that these small scattered fires brought this building down symmetrically. How do we bring a building down symmetrically? We have to remove, as we mentioned before, all the core columns followed by the perimeter columns, over 80 of them altogether, within a half a second or so. So without that, does fire have that precision is the question, and especially these fires. You got to answer these questions yourself. Use your intuition. How fast is the building coming down? Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Zero resistance?
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
Nist is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
In fact, even when the columns buckle, they still provide a minimum of 25% of their original capacity to hold up a load. That's just the nature of steel. So we never should have seen free fall acceleration at all, which Nist was forced into acknowledging that it did come down at free fall for a third of its 7-second fall. But they don't acknowledge the implications of free fall, which is that those columns had to have been somehow removed instantaneously across the football field width of this building. Because if it was a natural collapse, you would never see free fall. You would have at least a quarter of the strength of those columns. In other words, it would have slowed down. It would have decelerated, not accelerated. Do we have the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame? Well, yeah, this was a moment resisting steel frame structure where the columns and the beams are rigidly welded one to another, so you don't just get rocking and breaking of those connections. They're very rigid, many of them, and particularly on the exterior skeleton. So it's reduced to like a house of cards, to a pile about 6 stories tall. It should have been 20 stories tall if there was any kind of a natural collapse. Do we have limited damage to adjacent structures? Yes, the post office and the Verizon building had some damage, but other than that, the center of the pile is in the center of the footprint of the building. Do we have sounds of explosions heard by credible witnesses? Let's go first to Sham Sunder, who is the project leader of the Nist report.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse, nor reported by witnesses.
Huh. No? Well, let's take a look at some of them. Here's Daryl, a medical student, interviewed that day.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caved out.
A shock wave ripping through the building, the sound of a clap of thunder, the windows busting out, and then the building coming down. Not the building coming down creating those effects. Same thing here with Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
Huh. And this gentleman, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, they were trying to get back into the building, not realizing that it had been evacuated. And they're having all of these experiences inside the building. And this is after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, "You have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run."
More information of bombs. Bombs like this heard in the late morning of 9/11.
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay. All right. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
We're told that these are the sounds of buildings collapsing. Well, there's no other building collapsing after the Twin Towers collapsed and until Building 7 collapsed. And that's obviously an explosion, not the sound of one floor hitting another, which is the official narrative of these types of sounds. Speaking of official narratives, we do have a seismic signal occurring near the time of the collapse of Building 7, which developed a 0.6 magnitude event. So Nist tells us that, well, this was due to the collapse of the building. Well, let's look at it in a little depth and see if that's true. The seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds, but the building doesn't collapse until 10 seconds later. So how can the building collapse cause the seismic signal 10 seconds earlier? Well, Nist has an answer to this. A seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of collapse was likely due to the falling of debris from inside the collapse. Well, wait a minute. We looked at a video, here it is, that shows that the east penthouse falls 6 seconds earlier, not 10 seconds earlier. So it can't provide that. The rest of the penthouse and screen wall collapses only a half a second prior to the collapse of this building. And the collapse of this building is only a 6.5 second collapse. So none of that can be true, what Nist was claiming. We do have a geophysics expert, Andre Rousseau, who in 2009 and 2012 did an analysis. He's a applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. What does he say? Well, gosh, the bell-like form of the graph points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin. So you can look at that paper. And we also have something else to keep in mind. The pyroclastic-like clouds. What are we talking about here? The National Fire Protection Association 921, the guide for fire and explosion investigations. The authority around the world, largely, certainly here in America, says look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, these plumes are certainly directly observable after the final destruction. Take a look, racing away from every angle, down every street, away from Building 7 at 35 miles an hour, these plumes of unfolding cauliflower-shaped plumes indicating incredible heat developing from this event. Well, that heat is certainly not coming from these few small scattered fires in this building. Those certainly would have been extinguished by the mechanical action of the building falling itself. So what could it be? Could it be something like this, or on the order of this that we're looking for here? Well, let's see if we find it. In fact, we do. We have multiple bodies of evidence here to look at, including surface temperatures of World Trade Center 7 in excess of 1,340 degrees. Well, that is the temperature of the very hottest office fires. But guess what? There's no office fires on the surface of this pile. Again, those fires were extinguished by the action of the collapsing building. So what are we measuring here? We're measuring something much hotter, deeper down in the pile, that's capable of doing the kind of damage that can bring a building down. Let's take a look. Abul Hassan Astani Azal, first structural engineer who had access through a National Science Foundation grant to the landfill. What does he say?
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
I saw the melting of girders in World Trade Center. Now, office fires don't melt girders, but this girder is documented by him as having been melted. He doesn't know why or how, but he knows, just like firefighters and fire protection engineers, know that steel I-beams don't melt due to office fires. But the FEMA report, who developed this report before Nist got a hold of it and changed it, they said the steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. This is a quote from the author of the FEMA report. Well, wait a minute. What's he talking about here? This can't happen either due to office fires. There's a problem. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. It takes 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit to begin to melt it. Office fires are only, if even so, half, more likely a quarter of these temperatures. But here it is documented by FEMA in their May 2002 Building Performance Assessment Team report. The metallurgical examination of the steel identifies never before observed eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like you see from this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, that's molten iron, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. They have no explanation for the source of the sulfur. It's perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, cites the New York Times, but it's completely ignored by Nist, eliminated from the report when they took over. Nist says, well, we couldn't test the steel. We didn't have any steel to test. Again and again and again and again. They talk about we couldn't test the steel. No metallography could be carried out because no steel was recovered from World Trade Center 7. Well, where did that piece of steel come from that had silver dollar-like holes in it? Oh, it came from this pile and was found by John Gross, who's Sham Sunder's co-project leader, who provided this piece of steel to FEMA to be analyzed, only to later deny its existence. Yet his shadow is all over the evidence. The fires are maybe 1,200 degrees, says Thomas Iger. Well, steel doesn't melt till more than twice that temperature. How do we get the melting occurring? We're going to be looking at one possible source in a moment. Hydrocarbons, including jet fuel, by the way, it's just kerosene, doesn't burn any hotter than desks or chairs. 600 degrees to 1,400 degree temperatures. That's it. And yet steel or iron, and both, had definitely melted during the event, as you can see by the color of the liquid molten material pouring out of the jaws of this crab claw excavator. It is exceeding 2,500 degrees. That's just the physics of steel and iron. You can tell by its color what its temperature is. 2,500 degrees is more than twice what office fires can even get to in temperature. So what caused it to melt? Could thermite have caused all of that melting of steel? And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here finally, because if thermate were used, it would explain the presence of sulfur. It's added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. It would also explain the presence of elemental iron, which is the byproduct of thermite reactions. And we'll be looking for a lot of, we will be looking at a lot of evidence in a minute for elemental iron. It would also explain the presence of 4,000 degree temperatures, which is the byproduct of the liquid molten iron from thermite. So fascinating. Let's see what NFPA 921 also says. Look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. Nist found no corroborating evidence, they say, to suggest that explosives were used. Well, a year later, when pressed, they finally write, Nist did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find, you won't find what you won't look for. How others did, and it wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones was one of them, a nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, does analysis because the sculptor sent him this piece of slag from this beam from the World Trade Center. So he does some analysis on it. First of all, he notes that, gosh, this is not how thermite, how the welders, the iron workers cut through steel. They go from one point to another, like you see here. That is what oxyacetylene torches and thermite lances do. They don't zigzag across a beam like that. No, they're very efficient, and they don't do this either. So we have a real problem, but he analyzes the steel and makes the problem worse. It's got what? Iron, manganese, which is a real problem for the official story, sulfur, and aluminum, indicating an incomplete combustion or chemical reaction of the thermite. So he declares that this is not what we should be seeing in the World Trade Center steel. This is evidence of thermite. But even more damning to the official story is the findings of the U.S. Geological Survey. In their study of the powder in 2005 called the Particle Atlas of the World Trade Center Dust, what do they find? Billions of previously molten iron microspheres. They're about the 16th of an inch large, the largest of them in diameter. Most of them are naked to the human eye almost. They're very, very small. They're iron. Well, where does iron come from? Iron is the byproduct of thermite. Interesting. And molten iron at that. So this is incredible because up to 6% of some of these dust samples are molten iron microspheres. This is not some haphazard leftover material from something else. Up to 4 tons of this material by extrapolation throughout the dust. 150 times more in quantity than the background value of iron particles found in common office building dust like you see here, but they're not spherical like we see in the World Trade Center dust. And R.J. Lee Group, another environmental consulting firm, not another one, but a one, it says these were formed during the event, not before by the welders putting the structure together, not afterward by the iron workers cutting it apart, but during the event. And they're found, all over Manhattan, not just in the World Trade Center boundaries where the iron workers were cutting. And so R.J. Lee Group fascinatingly says these are formed during the event, and this is a result of the melting of iron or steel. That's important. The EPA says they're using it as a signature component to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. That is means it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these previously molten iron microspheres with an unknown origin. Well, where might they have come from? Here's an experiment with thermite. Stephen Jones ignites it. It looks like thousands of sparks, but they're molten iron, and they cool and they fall into the pan. Why are they spherical? Well, anytime you aerosolize a liquid, it becomes spherical by surface tension. So that's what raindrops, in fact, are spheres. And in this case, they cool and they fall on the cars around the World Trade Center. In this very high heat event, what else could be responsible? What rational explanation could there be for the toasting of the tops of these cars parked in and around the area? Well, you can make thermite cutter charges in your backyard, like John Cole, civil engineer, did as he ignites a steel with thermite in this case. And a lot of those are cut cleanly through. He's not a scientist. He's just trying to show us that you can make your own thermite-based cutter charges, but they're much more efficient devices, like this one invented prior to 9/11, which issues molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds, much more effective at cutting through greater thicknesses of steel. In fact, there are devices, in this case an igniter, whose casing itself is made out of consumable consolidated thermite, so that there's nothing left behind but pools of molten iron, which, as we'll see, is found all over the place at the World Trade Center. But first, let's go to what was found in the dust. Three inches thick from river to river, this powdered concrete. 7 independently collected samples were sent to this team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen. They find red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. These chips, they thought they were paint. They're 1/16 of an inch large, the largest of them. But they get real curious because they're attracted by a magnet. So they have a high iron content. So what's this? They get really curious, analyze the red layer, and what do they find? Iron and aluminum. The ingredients of thermite in the red layer of the red-gray chips. Shouldn't be there. This is not paint. They get real curious. They zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope into the red layer, and they find nanoparticles of iron oxide and aluminum powder, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Rhomboidally shaped iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets developed in a nanotechnology lab. Worse, they're set in an organic matrix of oxygen, silica, carbon. This is what is used for the expansion in TNT, gas expansion that knocks things over. So here we appear to have an incendiary thermite or nano or thermate in engineered to become more explosive. Well, they set it in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter. The energy is measured, that's put off at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. It ignites, producing what? Producing the same molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found and analyzed in the World Trade Center dust by R.J. Lee and the U.S. Geological Survey. So you see, this is a repeatable experiment that's self-corroborating, that could put a lot of people away for mass murder and treason if we succeed in the 3 independent cases that we have before judicial bodies. As if we didn't know where those spheres came from, they're found attached to partially ignited red gray chips, as you see here and here. So because of the extremely small size of these particles at the nanoscale, the surface volume increases exponentially. So the chemical reaction is virtually instantaneous. It's much more effective than normal thermite. It's engineered to become explosive. So this is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced, sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories. And it is peer-reviewed, this 25-page paper, in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, where they determined that the red layer is unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology, a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. It should not be found in all the World Trade Center dust samples that are collected, but it was. So we've been looking at direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Why? Well, let's look at fires for a minute. We've never lost a steel frame fireproof skyscraper due to fire. Well, one reason is the heat is conducted away. Steel is very dense. It conducts the heat away from its source. So it never gets to that 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. Well, that's real reasonable, but we don't want to take that chance. So we put cementitious fireproofing on the building just to keep that from ever being a problem. 2-hour protection. And there's a raging fire, can rage for 2 hours on the beams and on 3 hours on the columns. And that has been 100% successful in keeping these buildings from collapsing. What Nist did in their test was to eliminate the fireproofing. That's not a realistic test. And you saw all the other manipulations that they went through, including, while admitting that fire doesn't last for more than 20 or 30 minutes, claiming that with their fire simulation that it lasted well over an hour and a half. So we know that 2 and 3 hour fire protection is plenty enough, because there's only 30 minutes of fire in a given area, max. So we also require the contractor to build the building out of non-combustible materials like steel, fireproofing, etc. And we don't allow the tenants to bring in large fuel loads in these buildings. And just to keep fire from ever becoming a problem, we put sprinklers in these buildings. So the sprinklers were for a variety of reasons from the official narrative, inoperative on the afternoon of 9/11. So what about the FEMA and Nist reports? We had investigations. We talked about the FEMA report who found hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel. They had $600,000 worth of funding. Their efforts were quite hampered, though. They complained that they couldn't get access to the blueprints of the buildings, making inspections, getting access to the site, getting crucial information, getting photographs from the public. They just didn't. It didn't work out for them. They had their hands tied until Nist came along and produced a report on Building 7, beginning with the stated conclusion that fires caused the collapse. So they weren't trying to determine what caused the collapse. They were trying to come up with a set of reasons that were believable that fire caused the collapse. Truthfully, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7, they acknowledge in 2006. So with that metallurgical examination, even so, they don't look into it any deeper. FEMA, they suggest that further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve the issue of how the building came down. Unfortunately, for those hoping to resolve this issue, we have, in the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, 400 truckloads a day, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, taken off the WTC-7 site, put on barges, sent to China for recycling, prompting so many to cry out, in addition to the destruction of evidence, which is illegal in a crime scene. They cry out, Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And that's why we have so many experts offering their professional opinion, like Danny Jawenko, 27-year controlled demolition expert.
Danny Jawenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
And Hugo Bachmann, professor emeritus, chairman of the Department of Earth Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering. In my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was, with great probability, professionally demolished. And one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation. He says a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. What does that sound like? And the University of Alaska weighing in a 4-year, $300,000 study. The professor Leroy Halsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, performing the finite element analysis that Nist was tasked by Congress to perform, but which failed miserably, as we've seen. He has his own set of criteria here. It's a problem, right? No other tall steel frame building had ever failed due to fire. And these are steel frame fireproof buildings he's referring to. We got to ensure that for the public safety that the failure mechanism be understood. So he first examines the response to the fire loads, second, rules out scenarios that could not cause the collapse, and then identify the type of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. He uses the same input data that's available from Nist so that they're comparing apples to apples. the methodology we just went over, and he puts it in AutoCAD and then two FEA programs independently corroborating each other, Abacus and SAP. He reviews the same collapse analysis that and an area that Nist did, and found that no, it couldn't have worked. We have multiple problems. The girder could not even have been pushed off, even if the shear studs were missing, because of this side plate trapping the expanded girder, which would also have expanded if these other beams, long span beams, pushing the girder off of its seat. He found that, yeah, they omitted these shear studs, but they were there in the shop drawings. He omitted these stiffeners that we talked about, but they were in the shop drawings. There's 10 times less force from floor 13 falling on 12. Couldn't have broken those connections. And that even if that fire did heat up this floor, it would have pushed outward against the exterior structural wall system, which Nist made infinitely stiff for some unknown reason. And instead, so Nist found that it all pushed inward, which is how they got their movement east to west of that girder. So their conclusions are pretty important. Nist overestimated the exterior wall rigidity, clearly. Exterior walls were flexible, and the movement was in the opposite direction. The Nist assumptions that several beams were the connections on several beams were broken, was not valid. That the bolts fastening the girder to its seat wouldn't even have been broken. And so that 79, 80, and 81 columns did not fail. That if they did fail, the building would have tipped over, which is intuitive, right? If you take out your knee, you're going to fall in that direction. And so they also concluded that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns. So in their global model, in their global failure animation, they show that indeed it would have come down, in this case, very similar to the building. As well, let's look at this. They conclude that the fire did not cause the collapse of Building 7. The temperature was not hot and high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders, and it did not experience a progressive collapse as claimed by Nist. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns, which is modeled on the left side next to the video, compared to Nist's feeble rendering of the event, which stops just 2 seconds after the overall collapse, after releasing all 400 columns every second, connections every second. Very, very like firing a hose on a sand castle. Of course, it's going to fall apart. It's all in the input data, and they do not release that, of course. Do we have foreknowledge of this building's collapse? Well, an particular engineer was asked, if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse? And how soon? Well, he says, in its current state, you have about 5 hours. So for the first time in history, a steel frame skyscraper is collapsing ostensibly due to fire, and yet it's never happened before. And before it happens, this engineer, who we can't get the name of, he's anonymous, says you have about 5 hours. And sure enough, in 5 hours, the damn thing collapses. Prediction can only have been made with foreknowledge, of course. And they don't release the name of this engineer. Or these mysterious construction workers who are walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building and then looking straight into this CNN camera and saying this.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building as they coming down.
Building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. No flame, debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up, flame and debris coming down. What do they know? Fires don't blow up buildings, and there were only a few small scattered fires in this building. They were told not to fight the fire. They were told that the building had structural damage and that it was going to come down. Well, how does that square with this gentleman, his testimony? We heard him before talk about explosions like a train running under my feet. Well, he was held back 6 blocks or so away from building 7, behind the yellow tape. And he's listening to a radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker. And this is what he hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
What? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's going on here? Even more baffling is the announcement of the building's collapse 20 minutes before it happened.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. The details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. What, does that make them psychic to predict the collapse of a building? Better than that, 10:45 a.m. is when they called, or 11:07 is when they called this one. Take a look, CNN.
In New York, Alan Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
And just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke.
50 stories went down. There's no other 50-story building that went down. Building 7 is 47 stories, and it didn't go down until 5:20. There were some buildings that were damaged when the towers came down around them, but they didn't collapse. So what if this building was supposed to go down at that time? We wouldn't even have video of it because of the massive dust clouds that had already been created when the Twin Towers came down. Maybe it was supposed to go down at that time. Maybe those iron workers were fixing a dud that was not successful. So we don't know. That's all speculation, but it's interesting and important to at least be aware of, as is these statements by Larry Silverstein about the collapse of Building 7 made a year later on PBS.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Huh. They made that decision to pull. Well, Pullet is a term used in the controlled demolition industry. Larry Silverstein comes back. Oh, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. Well, guess what? The firefighters were not in the building. They were told early on not to fight the fire, that the building had structural damage. So there were no manual firefighting operations taken by the FDNY. So all kinds of lies from everywhere. With the science that we've been looking at, is this to you proof of the hypothesis of the building coming down by fire or by controlled demolition? Have we shown 10 key characteristics and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition? Is this to you direct evidence of destruction with explosives, or is it evidence of destruction by fire? Is there additional circumstantial corroborative testimony that supports the theory of controlled demolition? That's the question we have for you to answer, and you can answer that and get your other questions answered as well, as we'll take questions, won't we, Andy? How do they do that?
Absolutely. So please submit your questions in the input form we talked about before. That's ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if, now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Awesome. And there's the place to put your questions. While you're there, subscribe to our newsletter. It takes 60 seconds. Put in your name and your email, etc. And get informed because we'll be sending you the latest evidence that we're developing, the latest efforts we're getting toward having toward a real investigation, the products you can use for your own activism and educate others. So you can go to our website and get informed. We have an extraordinary evidence section with all of these videos, papers, really, really good, informative, quality stuff. It's not that hard to figure out as you've been listening here. You've already figured that out. Sign a petition. There's 20,000 others supporting the architects and engineers that are numbered over 3,400 at this point. So please join them in demanding a truly independent investigation, taking a public stance for the truth. That's what's needed in this day and age. And donate while you're there as well. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have all kinds of projects. We're making films now. We got a big one coming out on September 11th by director Dylan Avery of Loose Change 9/11. We have all kinds of efforts we're making toward reaching out to the engineers. We've spent years and years reaching out to architects as well, but also the public and the media. So become a member of AE 911 Truth. We, for as little as a cup of coffee a month, you can support us as a sustaining supporter. Join the family of sustaining supporters and volunteer if you are unable to do any of that. Andy, how do people volunteer with us?
Yeah, easiest way is go to ae911truth.org. You'll see the volunteer form is at the top in the menu. And a very quick application. You fill that out, we'll get in touch with you and see how you best fit in. A lot of that, as I always say, depends on how people think they'll best fit in. Some people like talking to the public and some people like to do quiet research and those kinds of things. But there's always something to do around here, and this is the kind of work that needs to get done so that we can get the very big work done of getting this issue exposed and in front of the public and a new investigation. So if you have the time to do it, be part of something big, and please consider volunteering.
Please, absolutely. And those are the teams you can join. It's fun, and we will love working together, and we're on a mission to wake up the country, because actually this is not just about buildings, is it? And as gruesome as it was, the loss of 3,000 people, we have an even bigger mission, and that is to reverse a $6.5 trillion global war on terror that has been launched by the attack on 9/11, particularly at the World Trade Center. And any of us, as a result of the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, any of us can be arrested without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. Our civil rights have been, civil liberties have been highly curtailed. We can be tortured or even assassinated for having some affiliation with terrorism, which is not even defined. So we've also murdered 2 million Iraqis and Afghanis, and in the wars there. That all goes back to 9/11, which blames fundamentalist Muslim hijackers, which, as you probably have figured out by now, probably did not have access to these very, very secure buildings, probably the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon. So yeah, get involved. The issue here is far deeper than you can imagine so far. And there are many other issues besides 9/11 you can get involved in as well. But you can talk to your elected representatives, television, radio, newspapers, tell everybody you know. Screen the DVDs with your friends, relatives, VIPs. Show them the brochures from our in our store. 100 of these evidence brochures. You can hand them out even on the street. And I'll show you those brochures next time. And you can download the 135-page evaluation by the University of Alaska at Fairbanks that I mentioned, and hand that to structural engineers. You can show them and others the movie Seven. It's out there everywhere now on Amazon. And traveling faster to an audience that is new to the subject. So we're very excited about that. We have submitted a request for correction to Nist, which is what you do with agencies that commit fraud. And we have gone back and forth with them. We are now suing them. So that lawsuit has been supported, and here we go back into the courts. We got to get this information into the courts, and we have a number of ways to do just that, but into government as well. Andy, how are we accomplishing that?
Absolutely. First step is deciding you're going to do it. It's actually not that hard. The first step is you figure out who your congressman is, which some people don't know. But once you figure that out, you go to their website and you try to have a meeting. And a lot of them are taking more phone meetings because of the modern issues going on right now in our world, current events. And that gives you an opportunity to have a meeting with them, with your representative, their staffers, and us. And we'll do a lot of the work if you want to. If you don't feel that comfortable talking about the evidence, you just know it's a controlled demolition and the evidence is right to you. You can just introduce yourself in the meeting and let Richard present the evidence as he is here. So the first step is you go there, you request a phone meeting, and then you can go to ae911truth.org/justice to learn more about the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. This is draft legislation that would establish a new, it would establish a select committee that would create a new investigation. It has to look into the information that Richard is presenting. It can't just get away with what it's been doing for all of these years and just regurgitating a bunch of Nist talking points. And of course, it's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower that morning. So it's very important, and it really reminds you of what this is all about. It's about the people who died on that day. So just a little bit of effort and a little bit of follow-up, and we'll even help you out. You can write to us at congress@ae911truth.org if you need any advice or help. But that little bit of effort can go a long way, and you never know. I mean, you could be the one that actually gets some action going. Maybe there's a good staffer or a good congressman who's ready to break the chains here, and it's yours, but you got to hit the first domino to get everything rolling. So please consider doing that.
Yep. I've done it. It's fun. I love to see congressmen's eyes widen as they see all this evidence that we've presented you. I'd love to see a special grand jury look at this evidence. We've submitted it, and we've sued the Attorney General in Manhattan to prove that he's actually given this information to a special grand jury, which they're required by law to do. And so that remains pending in the law. And a FBI lawsuit also, we've now submitted to the Supreme Court of the United States because they have said we don't have standing, but we do. They have said it doesn't matter that Judge Garland became Attorney General of the United States. He didn't have a conflict of interest. He did. So that's now going before, hopefully, if they accept it, the Supreme Court of the United States. We don't stop. We're doing everything we can. And so is the New York area, Franklin Square and Munson Fire District commissioners voting unanimously for a new investigation. And that was a powerful moment in our history. He says, you better believe, Chris Joya, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. So they're continuing their effort. And we are as well, since the making of this landmark documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out, where we submitted or got the testimony of 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. I want to give you just a peek at it and see what you think here, because it is the most extraordinary thing we've done in terms of getting the evidence into your hands so that you can share it with others.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We could speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what Nist has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
Nist has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
Nist excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
Nist concedes that they found no evidence
for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
You can watch it for free on YouTube, the 1-hour version. You can also get the DVD and share it. It's a 90-minute version, and it also includes the Meet the Experts bonus DVD with lots and lots of additional testimony from them. You can download Beyond Misinformation booklet for free. You can also buy the coffee table version, high quality booklet, which comes with an option that includes experts speak out. And our classic lecture on this series is available free on YouTube, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, as is Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner, 15 minutes, free on YouTube. I encourage you to get that. It's question and answer time. Andy, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we're going to take a lot of them, and I did manage to get the last minute ones in here. I'm going to just address the first one here. I saw this on YouTube, and somebody wrote, anyone heard about some FBI agent confession about controlled demolition? And there was some talk about that, and that is fake. There was a guy named Baxter Dimitri, and I don't even know if that's his real name, who would just put out joke stories. But the thing was, it's not even written like it's The Onion. He would just put the stuff out there to see if people would bite on it. I think it was either a month before or a month after. He had also put out a story about a former MI6 person confessing to killing Princess Diana, and it's the same picture of the same old man in a hospital bed. So it's just a guy playing with people. So there's no truth to that. The next question says, have any demolition companies reviewed the study from the University of Alaska on WTC 7?
Well, I don't know. What we have not done yet is send the Alaska study to the demolition companies. I don't know if they've taken it upon themselves to read it. These demolition companies, remember, are beholden to the federal government. They get most of their work from the federal government to take down these federally subsidized housing, for instance. So they're not going to be turning around and biting the hand that feeds them.
All right. Our next question asks, when I was talking to my friend about Building 7, he claims the floor is pancaked on themselves, and that's why it came down so fast. Your response?
Well, that's the official story. The progressive collapse put out by Nist as a story, a narrative, fails miserably as we've spent time today talking about it. It clearly was not a progressive collapse. It was not a pancaking collapse. Clearly, the evidence that I won't recite all of it right now shows irrefutably that the building was taken down by explosive controlled demolition. All you have to do is show your friend this video, and he will agree with you.
Okay, next question says, has anyone in your organization reached out to former Vietnam vet, American patriot, and award-winning documentary and movie director Oliver Stone to see if he would join your groups? He would be a powerful ally. He was recently in is it pronounced Cannes? Yeah, Cannes, France. And in an interview on July 14th on Going Underground RT, he talks about how obstructionists work against his efforts for truth. Thanks again. Great work.
Yeah, he is a truth teller. And we have approached him, and he has made comments, I forget what they are, about 9/11. It's not something he seemed to be interested in. But he's received our stuff. I've been told that. Andy, do you have any other awareness about that?
I'm not aware of his thoughts on 9/11. I know he made a 9/11 movie many years ago. It had Nicolas Cage in it, and it was about rescue workers who were trapped. Well, it was about, I think they were firefighters. It's been a long time since I've seen it, but they were trapped under the rubble. And it was pretty much official story. I do remember there is something in there, and I'd have to watch it again. So don't quote me, but it's worth watching just from a historical perspective. But there's something where people hear explosions, like a scene. They're like, what are those noises? But that is the only thing that kind of, might lean towards our side of things in it. So I don't know what he thinks about it.
Yeah, we'd certainly like to approach him. In fact, I'll commit to sending him our information also, because I hate to get questions like this. And then it's been 15 years since we've been at this, and we've sent our stuff to almost everybody we could think of, and I'm sure including him, but maybe it's time again.
All right, this came into the question box. It's more of a sentiment, but says 20th anniversary is approaching so soon. What a crazy feeling it is. Thank you for the research, education, and advocacy. And all I have to say is thank you for the support. The official 9/11 story now is old enough to vote, fight in a war, drive a car. Not old enough to drink yet. Got to wait another year. But that's how far we are. And I talk to people, volunteers who are like actual young people, people who were babies back when that happened. And, it's just kind of crazy how this time has passed. But I think a lot more people know the truth. And so much as we've gained so much as the truth movement. We've got the University of Alaska study. We've educated so many people over the years. So I think we're making some tremendous strides, and it really took the legs out from under the people who try to obstruct this and cover it up. So, and that's really a big part of that is just the supporters out there spreading this message.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys and for supporting us as well as we do our part to spread the message and to supply you with the materials you need to go out there and be credible. Use the credibility of 3,400 architects and engineers. Let them call us conspiracy theorists. That's why we're here.
All right, so I'll just add that I'm proud now when people call me that. They mean it as a slur, but I say keep on talking, because there's more and more of us every day. So for my part, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah, and today we looked at 9/11, an architect's guide, the first part, which is about World Trade Center Building 7. A week from today, we go into the Twin Towers and we look at the explosive destruction. After that, part 3, we go into the extreme heat. And so join us each week. And if you miss one, you can just look it up on YouTube. There's hundreds of them now on YouTube. You can't fail but to find them. So we'll be back next week. And until then, thanks, Andy, and thanks, everybody. Bye for now.